Okay, welcome back, everybody, for the last two panels, which are going to be strung one after another with no break. And then we're going to wrap up with a hopefully big discussion of all of these points that we've been raising and issues that you've been thinking about for 2 days, and see where we go from here. So this panel is going to be chaired by Rosalind McKever, who we know from yesterday morning in the Boccioni talk, so I will pass it on to you.
As you heard yesterday, even reading Giuseppe's abstract taught me something that I was then able to include in my paper as I didn't previously know it. So I'm very pleased to be introducing them all on a panel that follows on from the previous panel that raised a lot of interesting issues. But the three papers here are issues that are particularly crossing national borders. And we've already heard throughout the conference, particularly Mira talking yesterday about this lack of cohesion across borders, and we've readily understood how commonplace it is for artists to be working in different countries, sold and bought in different countries, casting in different countries, to the jurisdiction that they may be associated with in any way. So I will hand over quickly and introduce our first speaker, Giuseppe Calabi, who graduated cum laude from the University degli Studi di Milano and obtained a Master of Law from Harvard Law School in 1990, and has been a member of the Milan Bar since 1989 and is a member of the Harvard Law School Leadership Council in Europe. That he has very many wonderful qualities, which you can read in the full bio, but thinking of time, I'll just pick out a few particularly important things. He's a member of the Copyright Commission for the Italian Publishers Association, and advises auction houses, galleries, and private collectors. He's the legal counsel for the Italian National Association of Auctioneers and the Italian Association of Modern and Contemporary Art Dealers. And he's now appointed by the Italian Minister of Cultural Property as a member of the working group in charge of drafting the implementing measures of the recent reform of Italian heritage law on international circulation, which I imagine must be incredibly complicated. So I'm already in awe of you, and I'm sure about to be for even further so.
Yes, and I'm not going to talk about the reform, because this would be certainly...
That's another.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, and welcome everybody back to the conference. I'm going to be talk about I'm going to be addressing a comparative law analysis between two legal systems, Italy and France. Italy is my jurisdiction. I know a little bit about France. I'm not going to repeat what has already been told by the other more qualified speakers, in particular what Judy told earlier this morning. Well, I would just start with by this slide, and this just is a comment that is also the result of what we've been discussing today. Certain terms, authentic, unique, original, as opposed to fake, serial, copy, reproduction, in the common language may have a similar or identical meaning, but in the legal world, they have very different meaning and legal consequences, effects. My analysis, my brief presentation will examine 4 court cases, 2 French cases and 2 Italian cases. And these are the artists I will be, that were not directly, but their works have been involved in these cases. Now, as we will see from this presentation, national courts have offered different answers to the following questions. After the artist's death, who is entitled to carry out posthumous casting and subject to what limitations? Second question, how should a posthumous cast be presented to the world, the general public and prospective buyers, by intermediaries, scholars, authors of Catalogue, Raisonné, and museums? So different answers to the same questions, and I think, and this is going to be the bottom line of my presentation, these questions would give rise to other questions. If national laws fail to provide uniform answers, should a uniform supranational regulation be sought? And in case there is no possibility to have a uniform supranational regulation to be achieved, could self-regulation by trade or scholar association fill the gap? So these are open questions. Of course, I do not pretend to give a detailed answer to these questions. But let's start from, comparative law analysis implies that two legal systems be compared, of course. Let's start with what we've been talking about very much yesterday and today, reproduction right. So French and Italy belong to the same category, the same legal system. I mean, they're both civil law systems for those of you who are not lawyers, as opposed to common law jurisdictions. And they have certain similarities, but they also have striking differences when it comes to reproduction right. Very quickly, in both countries, the artist has an exclusive reproduction right, and this comes directly from their respective copyright laws. The duration of copyright follows the rule a life of the artist plus 70. The reproduction right can be assigned by will or contract. But now here comes the big and important difference. This brings us to the theme of the subject of this conference. The sale of the mold in France does not determine the assignment of the reproduction right. So if you sell the physical object, this does not involve the sale of an intellectual property right, in particular the reproduction right. Under Italian law, the sale of the mold does determine the assignment of the reproduction right, unless otherwise agreed. So do you all appreciate that there is an important difference here, because the burden of proving that there was a different agreement lies on the person who challenges somebody else's cast. This is quite clear. And we'll see that this, of course, we're talking about a copyright, so this right expires 70 years after the death of the artist. Moral rights. We've been discussing moral rights yesterday with my co-panelist and colleague. Her name is difficult to... Mira, yes. More or less same principles under Italian and French law. But so in particular, both systems, unlike, for example, the American system, whereas, as we could see yesterday, moral rights finish after when the artist or the author dies. So in France and in Italy, moral rights are perpetual, and they are not subject to any statute of limitation. This is an important, and we discussed this yesterday, and we discussed yesterday, for those who are not here today, whether this is why America decided not to follow this principle whereby moral rights are perpetual. But then here there comes another important difference between Italy and France. Moral rights in France can be bequeathed by the artist to third parties, including foundations or archives. In Italy, moral rights after the death of the artist are, by operation of law, even if the artist doesn't say anything in his or her will, are automatically assigned to the direct descendants, to the spouse and the direct descendants. And this for an unlimited term, so because moral rights are perpetual. So under Italian law, archives and foundations can never be entitled to moral rights. Only the children, the grandchildren, and the great-grandchildren, and theoretically, a descendant of Leonardo da Vinci could be entitled to moral rights, if there is any. Judith told us about certain provisions that are, under the French law legal system, and in particular what strikes in terms of an important difference between Italy and France is that France provides a certain number of casts that can be made out of an original mold. We said 8, but then it depends on whether this is these provisions are in the tax code, in the French tax code. In Italy, there is no such provision. So whoever enjoys the reproduction right, whether this be the artist or his heir, is entitled to make any amount, any number of casts that he or she will see appropriate. There is no legal limitation with respect to reproduction rights defined by law. We very quickly, the droit de suite is another, we discussed this morning, a droit de suite or a resale right is a European, there was a European directive that was implemented more or less uniformly across Europe. But here there is a definition of original and copy, and that may have some bearing on the matters that we've been discussing today. According to the directive, copies of works of art which have been made in limited numbers by the artist himself or under his authority shall be considered to be original works of art for the purpose of the directive. I emphasized for the purpose of the directive because one cannot, in my opinion, draw from this provision a general rule that copies should be made in a limited number. As I said, under Italian law, copies can be made in an unlimited number, and this would not make any particular difference, as whether in the discussion whether this should be a certain copy is a copy or should be considered as an original. Let's go to the cases very quickly. We 4 cases, 2 French court cases and 2 Italian court cases. The first is a case that was decided by the Tribunal Correctionnel de Paris 4 years ago, and surprise, surprise, had a Rodin's work involved. The title of this case could be a quasi-industrial production of Rodin's work, and very briefly, we learned this morning what is the situation with Rodin's rights, moral rights, the copyrights terminated 70 years after the death of the artist, that is to say in 1986, and the French state was indicated as the heir of Rodin in his will. But we already discussed this morning, but let's go to the case. The case involved an Italian company called Gruppo Mondiale and its beneficial owner, an American businessman called Gary Snell. They were accused of being involved in the production, exhibition and sale of Rodin casts not authorized by the Musée Rodin. The copyright had already, was already finished. In the 1990s, Snell acquired several plasters, including plaster of the Thinker and the Age of Bronze of Rodin's sculptures. Since 1998, Gruppo Mondiale carried out a mass production of bronzes from the plasters. The court-appointed expert identified 1,710 bronzes. The casts, and this is important, were made by a foundry based in Italy, near Vicenza. Now, what did the judgment, the court, this was a criminal court, the criminal law decision, the criminal court of Paris held the following. So, the patrimonial rights, in particular the reproduction right of Rodin's oeuvre, had expired, and the only rights that may allegedly be violated were moral rights that are perpetual under French law. The violation of the moral right may only result in an unfaithful reproduction or in a statement that the reproduction is an original, and that the sculptures made by Gruppo Mondiale did not, and this is very important for what I will say about Italian court, the 2 Italian court cases, because the sculptures did not have a reproduction quality level sufficient to allow to state that the moral right was respected. So this was a statement by the French court, and the consequence of the statement was that under French law, they could be considered as counterfeits because they were reproduced in an unfaithful manner, the original model tel que voulu par l'artiste. However, and this is most important, the French court, said the Tribunal Correctionnel, does not have jurisdiction because the casting, exhibition, sale, and exportation of the artworks took all place outside the French territory. It is irrelevant that the sellers of the plasters were based in France. All the sales took place abroad. So, furthermore, the court stated that there were no unfair commercial practices by Gruppo Mondiale. There was a website that was published in English and based outside France. The circumstance that the French public had access to the website does not establish the French jurisdiction. And this is what the court eventually said. Unfortunately, I'm quoting court judgment, it was not proven that the book self-published by Gruppo Mondiale reproducing the casts had been distributed in France. As a result, the French Tribunal Correctionnel declined its jurisdiction. If all these facts had taken place in France, then the court would have said there is a violation of moral rights, and consequently there would have been criminal sanctions against Mr. Snell, who I think still lives peacefully in America. Case number 2, and this is a case that has involved another very important institution, French institution, the Fondation Alberto e Annette Giacometti. And here we are in a situation where the reproduction rights still exist. So 70 years have not elapsed since the artist's passing. So here is a case, typically a case about copyright. Now, this slide represents the complicated estate situation of Giacometti. Most of you are art historians and may know about Giacometti estate, but there is a Fondation Alberto e Annette Giacometti that owns 5/8 of the full ownership of the estate, and then there are other interests, in particular, divided by 3 different subjects, 2 actually different subjects. One is the family Berthoud, that owns 2/8, and then there is the Alberto Giacometti Stiftung, that is, I think, a Liechtenstein-based foundation or Stiftung. So these are the holders of the copyrights of Giacometti, Alberto Giacometti. And this is the case. Alberto Giacometti made 2 plaster sculptures, Projet d'un monument à Gabriel Péri, 1946, and Projet pour une place, same year. In 1956, Alberto Giacometti donated the 2 works to his brother Diego. In 1983, Diego sold the 2 works to Mr. G. I'm not mentioning the name. And in 1984, Diego authorized Mr. G to cast 8 bronzes from the 2 plasters. And these are the 2 bronzes. Now, the question that, well, of course, there were some reactions from the Fondation Alberto e Annette Giacometti and from the other heirs of the Giacometti, part of the Giacometti estate. The first question that the court, and here the judgment is by the Court of Appeals of Paris, the first question was Diego entitled to authorize the reproduction of the 2 plasters? Now, the answer was no, he was not entitled, because as we see, unlike what we will see under Italian law, the fact that the plaster was sold, was donated to Diego, and then sold by Diego to Mr. G, did not determine the transfer of the reproduction right. The reproduction right remains with in the artist and then the estate. there was no evidence that Alberto had transferred during his lifetime or bequeathed his reproduction rights to his brother Diego. If Diego was not the reproduction right holder, then he could not have transferred this right to Mr. G when he sold him the two plasters, although he, in fact, in the contract, it was indicated that Mr. G was indeed entitled to make reproductions, but Diego did not have the right to reproduction himself, so he could not have transferred this right to his assignee. There was the court was very strict here and established the counterfeit and held the counterfeit claim that was brought by the Fondazione Alberto e Annette Giacometti against Mr. G. So the illicit reproduction resulted in a counterfeit. So there was no right to make any reproduction. There were damages, and here we're talking about relevant damages. The damage was identified in the region of 1.6 million euros as a result of a violation of patrimonial and moral rights. As the Fondazione only had 5/8 of the estate, they were awarded 1 million. And here is it's interesting what the French court said. Illicit cast caused the moral damage to the right holders per se. So there's no need to prove what was the damage, and irrespective of the casting quality of the counterfeited works, because the illicit reproduction results in a, the French said, important atteint au droit d'exploitation et de reproduction de l'artiste et des ses ayant droit et en banalisant les œuvres ainsi reproduites. The question that remains open, so there was this important, the damages were Mr. G was condemned to pay a substantial amount of money, but the court did not address what is going to happen with the counterfeited works. So it did not address this particular situation, whether they could be destroyed or whether they could be, what. So probably these casts are still out in the market. The only consequences here were damages. Then this is another important point of the judgment. Mr. G's claim to have the two plasters and the 8+8 cast inserted in the Catalogue Raisonné, and he also wanted to obtain an authenticity certificate. So the first, this claim was dismissed. The foundation did not have any obligation to publish a Catalogue Raisonné here. So, and in addition to this, it did not have any obligation to issue authenticity certificates. So there was here, the Catalogue Raisonné was not a task of the foundation, but rather was a project undertaken by the association that was the predecessor of the foundation. It's a complicated situation. I'm not going to go into details. But at the end of the day, the Association Alberto e Annette Giacometti did not refuse to include the two plasters, but they refused to include in the Catalogue Raisonné the result of what were considered to be counterfeited works. So the two plasters were included, but not the casts. Finally, we said that the Fondation was entitled to get a 1 million euro award in damages, but there was here, as Diego Giacometti had authorized without having the right to do so, the reproduction, then Mr. G was indemnified himself by the legitimate heir of Diego, that was the Stiftung, the Giacometti Stiftung. So the court took into account the fact that Diego, without having any right to do so, did guarantee to Mr. G that he had the right to make the reproductions. Okay, this is, and the court said Diego could not have ignored that he did not have the right to authorize the cast, and Mr. G was not an art market expert and may have ignored that Diego did not have any entitlement. However, considering that he made 2 extra casts, he went beyond what he was allowed to do under French law, then they decided to reduce this indemnization to 50%. So basically, the court decided in a very, like you applied a sort of a rule of thumb and said, well, maybe 50% of the responsibility is with Mr. G and 50% is with the Stiftung. Sorry. Yes, I mean, I'll be very quick. Yes, two cases, the 2 Italian cases. One is a criminal case decision by that has to do that deals with the work by an Italian artist called Giacomo Manzù. So here, very, very quickly, Giuseppe Pizzigoni, an architect from Bergamo, made in 1933 a monument dedicated to the Calvi brothers, 4 heroes of World War I. The architect instructed Giacomo Manzù, who is an Italian sculptor, to decorate the monument with 5 reliefs. Attilio Pizzigoni, son of Giuseppe, inherited from his father the plaster molds used for casting the reliefs. He made further casts, which he exhibited and donated. So these are the bas-reliefs that were made for the monument. The widow of Manzù refused to authenticate Mr. Pizzigoni's casts and requested that the owner refrain from selling or otherwise disposing of them. In 1981, the artist's secretary wrote to Attilio Pizzigoni, who was the son of the architect who made the monument, recommending that the cast of the plasters be limited to 2 because the maestro hated serial reproductions of his works. Upon denunciation by the widow, the plasters and the cast were seized by the Tribunal of Bergamo, and Attilio Pizzigoni was indicted with counterfeit charges. The charges were based on the allegation that he had illicitly reproduced the artist's works and disposed of them as authentic works. Now, the outcome is that the Italian Supreme Court held that the holder of the plaster, as we said, this is the major difference from French law, the holder of the plaster is entitled to make reproductions, and each of them must be considered as authentic. If the holder makes more reproduction than the number that he is entitled to make, then he is responsible for copyright violation, but this would not qualify as a counterfeit, unlike what the French court had decided in the Giacometti case. The burden of proof lies on who alleges copyright violation. Last case, this case involves a minor Italian sculptor of the 20th century, Sergio Toffanari, and the case is against the foundry that worked with the artist. And this is a particularly interesting case, as if you compare it with the Rodin case that we examined before. Toffanari made these kinds of sculptures of animals, and he was quite popular at his time, but not anymore. The granddaughter of Toffanari sued the foundry, that is an important Italian foundry called Marinelli, with whom the artist had cooperated during his lifetime, alleging that the foundry had violated the moral rights related to the artist's over. Copyrights had expired already. She requested the seizure of the plaster molds and all the posthumous casts and claimed their restitution and damages. During his lifetime, again, Toffanari sold his plaster molds to Marinelli. According to a witness deposition, the artist never played an active role in the bronze casting process. He only made minor touch-ups in the wax mold made from the original plaster mold. So he was not very much involved. He approved the sale of casts, which were entirely made, including the patina, by the foundry. After the artist's death, the foundry continued to cast and sell Toffanari's bronzes. According to the tribunal, there are no doubts that the foundry was entitled to the reproduction right. Posthumous casts cannot be considered as original. This was a clear statement, and the court didn't go very much into details on this. The expert witness instructed by the tribunal argued that the posthumous casts were of a different aesthetic quality than those made during the artist's lifetime, but the tribunal disagreed. So unlike the Rodin case, where quality was considered very important in assessing whether or not there was a violation of moral rights, the Italian court said that invoking the aesthetic quality of a cast involves a subjective, axiomatic, and not motivated judgment, which is not allowed. So the reproduction may also, mind this is an important statement, be approximate to the original because its purpose is to convey to the viewer a similar visual and spiritual perception. Minor differences between the copy and the original do not cross the threshold that would determine a violation of moral rights. And this, again, through modern reproduction techniques, a copy could even reach a perfection level that may cause embarrassment among the artist expert. A correct, authentic reproduction must conform to the mold made by the artist and not to the casts made during the artist's lifetime. The correct sale catalog entry, here again we're talking about labels, should be posthumous reproduction after an original mold. I'm getting to a conclusion here. What is the applicable laws? We see that artists frequently are born in a certain jurisdiction and then die in another jurisdiction, but what is the applicable law? We could see that Italian law is different from French law, which in turn is different from American law. And here there's no clear answer on this. So conflict of laws are frequently an issue at stake among lawyers in cases like this. And this is an open question. Again, if national laws fail to provide uniform answers, a uniform supranational regulation should be sought in terms of a convention or at the European level, a directive or regulation would do the job, but at a more international level, other instruments should be considered. Self-regulation by trade or scholar association must fill the gap. And I think that this is all what I wanted to say, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. Our next speaker is Paula Hornbostel. She's the director of the Lachaise Foundation, where she had become a trustee in 2000. She's delivered lectures on artists at museums around the world and has helped museums exhibit the work of Gaston Lachey, most recently at the Portland Art Museum, the David Finley Jr. Gallery in New York, and the New York Studio School. Oh, thank you. She's worked for 11 years at Salander O'Reilly Galleries in New York, where she helped to organize the exhibition Gaston Lachey Sculptures and Drawings, which traveled to England, France, Italy, Germany, and the Czech Republic. And she's currently working with Charles Riley II to lend works by Lachaise to Anything Goes, the Jazz Age, at the Nassau County Museum of Art, happening now?
Yes.
Right now. Go to that. She is a trustee of the New York Studio School and speaks French and Italian. So we'll probably be very much interested. You have a mic there, so
Yes,
off
great.
you go.
It's working? Okay, great. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much, Katy and Sharon, and the Motherwell Foundation, the Dedalus Foundation, sorry. Gaston Lachey was an American modernist sculptor. He was born in Paris in 1882. As a small boy, he remembers feeling dizzy as he walked up the Eiffel Tower because his father was carving the cabinetry for the private apartment of Gustave Eiffel, and you can go up there and actually walk around it in about 20 seconds. He attended the École des Beaux-Arts, contemplating the masterpieces of the past, as he put it in his autobiography. I could not stand the Grec subject anymore. So one day, one spring day, he was exiting the École des Beaux-Arts gates, and he spied a majestic woman walking along the bank of the Seine. She proceeded to lure him to America, where he arrived at the young age of 23. She looked a little like that. He never returned to France. While Lachey never quite mastered the English language, he did master his materials and the female form. E.E. Cummings called him the man through whose touch a few cubic inches become colossal. Marsden Hartley called him an indomitable pagan who saw the entire universe in the form of a woman. And I should mention that his wife, the woman that he spied, was 10 years older than he was with a son. But those are details. He carved directly in coral stone, alabaster, marble, granite, sandstone, and wood, making hundreds of sculptures and thousands of drawings during his lifetime. Mostly his sculptures were inspired by his muse, who was also his wife, Isabelle Duteau Nagel. She was unhappily married, Cupid struck, and Lachaise never wavered. Jean Clair, the former head of the Musée Picasso in Paris, has interestingly compared his work from the 30s with that of Picasso. But the comparison ends there. Lachaise was not like Picasso in his devotion to his one wife. You are the goddess I seek to express in all my work. And as Louise Bourgeois put it, Gaston Lachey had one god, and it was a woman, his wife, and he put her on a pedestal both literally and figuratively. You can see the likeness. I've put a photograph of Isabelle taken by Gaston himself on the rocks near Georgetown, Maine, probably somewhere in Maine. And those are her proportions of her body. Some see links to the voluptuous goddesses of Indian temple sculpture and ancient fertility figures. He sure seems to have been inspired by this Etruscan lady of 500 BC when he made Woman Walking, 1919. I found that this was acquired by the Boston Museum of Fine Art in 1901. So it was clearly on view, and Lachaise loved to go visit museums and look at ancient works. So it's probable that he saw this work. On the other hand, it is just a woman walking, and she has one leg in front of the other, and she has clothing, so that's not so... These are unique reliefs. The plaster models are assumed to be destroyed. As I said, most of his works depicted what he described as woman with a capital W. This woman had expensive taste, and he had to pay the bills, so he accepted commissions. This is for James Deering. He had a beautiful mansion, built a beautiful mansion called Vizcaya, south of Miami, and he employed a number of contemporary artists, including Sterling Calder and Robert Winthrop Chandler and Lachaise. He made this memorial to the Coast Guard, the seagull, and these reliefs at Rockefeller Center, the old AT&T building, GE building, or RCA building, now Comcast. And he did portraits. He was embraced by the Dial magazine, and he did many portraits of people associated with the Dial. Marianne Moore, Scofield Ther. This is E.E. Cummings, one of his great friends, whom he met through his stepson, Edward Nagel. They were at Harvard together. Many people have commented on the experience of watching Lachaise's work. Reminiscing about the 1924 sittings, Cummings recalled that as Lachaise's thumb pressed into the temples of the clay head, he felt sympathetic responses in his own nervous system. Now hearing this, you think that must be some powerful piece. Well, it was for Cummings, and that bronze recalled the way Lachaise's modeling of him made him feel. Similarly, when the work of those thumbs yielded a likeness that was then transferred into plaster, more bronzes could be made, helping poetry appreciators around the world summon the author of lines that made them feel like, "What I want to know is how do you like your blue-eyed boy, Mr. Death?" The majority of his surviving works are bronze casts, such as these. To make these, he made models of clay, sometimes adding plasticine, and from those, plaster models, to be later cast in bronze. Often Lachaise had no money. He exhibited his plasters stained with a dark patina to resemble bronze. Many of those works he did end up casting during his lifetime, and many are stained now because of the casting process. The Foundation has diligently kept records of all known casts, cataloging new works as they arise. Today I will be talking about posthumous casts. There are basically 3 categories of posthumous casts in the oeuvre of Lachaise: authorized casts overseen by his widow, authorized casts overseen by the Lachaise Foundation, and unauthorized casts. With all these come questions of patina, markings, provenance, value, artistic intention, which are interesting but also fraught with inevitable pitfalls. Attempting to get as close to the artist's intention while respecting his legacy can be at once rewarding and challenging. We have guidelines and rules. The exception makes the rule, so we've authorized, the foundation was established in 1963. After Lachaise died in 1935, his widow, who was 10 years older than he, outlived him by 22 years, very carefully guarding the estate and refusing attempts by dealers to buy plaster casts. And she kept them together, and she was often desperate, financially desperate, but she was devoted to the work of Lachaise. Reminded me of the story of Kiesler we heard yesterday, and his widow. Editions range from 6 to 12 bronze casts, the total number of each edition having been established to take account of bronze casts known to the foundation prior to our organization. All casts are clearly labeled, bearing the stamp Lachaise Estate, and are numbered consecutively according to the size of its limited foundation edition. After all casts of the edition have been made, the molds are destroyed and the plaster retained or disposed of by the foundation in a manner designed to safeguard against further casting. Sometimes we request that the foundry send us an image of the rubber mold that's been cut. The Lachaise Foundation has always kept good records. In 2005, it was decided to make one additional cast, freeing up the last cast in the edition for sale. So we had always kept one for ourselves, for our own purposes. And this way, now we decided to make one artist proof, which is not really an artist proof. It's a kind of a misnomer, but it's what's understood to be the one outside of the edition as we understood it. Except for a very few, all estate casts have been made at the very excellent, multi-generation, family-run modern art foundry on 41st Street in Queens. Lachaise often signed his models or bronzes, but not always, and when he did, the style and method vary. Mostly he signed the plasters, but sometimes he used a grinder to sign his name in the bronze. We can track when he did this and how his signature evolved. Very often, Lachaise affixed a year of copyright. He liked for his work to be as recent as possible. The opposite is true with historians who always like to predate his work. He never numbered his work, although he did refer on rare occasions to editions. For example, when he bought a plot of land by selling an edition of 11 casts of the portrait of John Marin to Via Gallery. And they hadn't yet been cast when he sold them. He pre-sold them. There are 17 casts that we know of today. 9 were cast in the fall of 1930. 14 are in museums today. Thus the importance of records. And Lachaise and Isabel also kept very good records, sometimes with illustrations. We also rely on Donald Goodall's 1969 PhD at Harvard. That is the backbone of the Catalogue Raisonné. He worked very hard to establish the location of known works. And we've been correcting some errors along the way with the help of Virginia Bedney, who is working on gathering information for the Catalogue Raisonné. Here we have a torso from 1932. Findlay Galleries has provided this image. They are the exclusive representative of the estate. You can see at the lower left the stamp Lachaise Estate. Next to it is the edition number, so that's there was an edition of 10, which assumes to me the known existence of 2 works. That's what I just assume when I look at that. And on the lower right is the foundry mark, MA, intertwined for modern art, and the year in which the cast was made. I always ask them, what are you going to do in the year 3015? But they don't seem to want to think that far ahead. in the early 90s, it was required that the foundry inscribe on the work the year the cast was made. That's no longer required, but I encourage them to continue doing that to help avoid confusion. During his lifetime, Lachaise used a variety of methods, including sand casting and lost wax. He employed a variety of foundries and experimented with the newest techniques as they came along, such as metal plating. Virginia Budney, who is working on the Catalogue Raisonné, always likes to see the inside of the work as it can reveal the process by which it was made. You can, in this case, see traces of investment, which is a part of the lost wax method, and whoever made this mold should have probably removed more of the investment. The foundries themselves tried to make the public comfortable with the idea of multiples and to help prevent unauthorized casting, more importantly. There was this plan spearheaded by Bob Spring at the Modern Art Foundry, the son of John Spring, with whom Lachaise may have worked before coming to the Modern Art Foundry. They've cast his works since they began. This is an estate stamp and a foundry mark from the 80s, early 90s. You'll notice the Art Founders Guild mark. It says AFG. And the idea was to coordinate foundries in stamping authorized casts. There were 6 foundries participating. They would write up a form and send it to, ideally, the Smithsonian, but the Smithsonian didn't agree to take this on. And the Modern Art Foundry accepted these for a while, and then they stopped. Some works were not cast during the artist's lifetime. For example, Torso with Arms Raised and In Extremis. These were his sensual sculptures. And to quote Michael Kimmelman, Lachaise's art was at its most potent when it was at its most anti-classical. He had a retrospective in 1935, and he chose not to include certain works because he wanted to establish himself first and then surprise everyone. Here's another one. I call this Origine du Monde because there are so many torsos. It's an unofficial title, but it reminds me of Courbet's work. And of course, it's not up there, but everyone can imagine Iris, Messenger of the Gods by Rodin. If we hadn't cast this work, it wouldn't have been able to go to the exhibition on Origine du Monde at the Musée Courbet. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about value because it sold for $50,000 in 1992, and it confirms that value is what someone is willing to pay for a work and the importance of a good dealer. I also am really happy that this work is now in the collection of the Musée Courbet. I had always dreamt of having a work at the Musée d'Orsay, but the birth limits or death limits, I always forget, I need Lord de Margerie, prevented Lachaise from entering the collection, and the Musée Courbet and the Musée d'Orsay now have a partnership, so in a way, this is connected to the Musée d'Orsay. There's a cast of a work made posthumously called Knees. It's a fragment, it looks just like Knees. Lachaise delivered these to Eddie Warburg at the Jewish Museum, which was then the Warburg home, and Mrs. Warburg said, I have better knees than those, but they ended up at the Met. Here's a pair of standing women from 1932. One is in the Milwaukee Art Museum. You can see the state cast signature edition, and the one on the right is from, I'm sorry, the one on the left is at MoMA, the one on the right is Milwaukee. So assuming the work is not a work that Lachaise would have finished in a special way, special textures, details, if the plaster is in a finished state and in good shape, and if it's a good casting, you should not be able to see much of a difference. When that's true, you see less of a difference also in the prices. One dealer had a formula, which is that lifetime cast can be 4 to 5 times more than a foundation cast. A distinction to remember, Isabel casts are closer to the artist, and they're not lifetime, but they might be more valuable. There are lots of exceptions. If these two were next to each other, I sometimes say, maybe you would see the better quality of one over the other. But in this case, actually, the writer Gerald Nordland said that in a journal he published that he thought that the posthumous cast was a better cast than MoMA's. This cast of MoMA's was cast in Germany. It came over and it was at the Lyman Allen Museum in New London, Connecticut, and then entered the collection of MoMA. It then traveled to Philadelphia, Venice, Paris, Frankfurt, Moscow, the Whitney, Ohio, Los Angeles, the Whitney, and it went for a time to the New York Botanical Garden in the Bronx. So no wonder the posthumous cast is maybe slightly fresher. The good news is the bronze is in good shape. The sculpture can be polished. And the patina grows better with age, in my opinion. Speaking of patinas, this is a cast in the Tuileries Gardens on the right, and that needs to be polished more often than most. The pigeons like her. My title, 50 Shades of Bronze. Patina can be described as a thin layer that forms on the surface of, in this case, bronze. Might tarnish. It can be produced by oxidation or other chemical processes, or a change of a surface through age and exposure. Patinas can provide a protective covering to materials that would otherwise be damaged by corrosion or weathering. We have a work in Portland, Oregon that just received a scratch, and in my opinion, that's the cost of exposure. The benefits outweigh the risks. A lot of people have seen her in front of the museum. It's great. And it's a posthumous cast, so I'm not so concerned with a lifetime patina. And the Portland conservator is very skilled. A lot has changed since the Chinese buried their work, leaving instructions where their descendants could find the work and hope for the best. Lachaise experimented with many patinas during his lifetime, from matte black to bright gold. On the top, second from the left, you can see the Stieglitz cast, which has a nickel plating, and he has left some of the original patina light bronze as a highlight. It's at the nipples and the hair and the drapery. These are colors he used in his lifetime, and the Lachaise's Foundation has done its best to emulate when completing his additions. This is Woman Arranging Her Hair, LF7. The one on the left is a lifetime cast at the Whitney, and you can see 3 posthumous casts, all different colors. Here's a lifetime cast that's a lighter brown. There's also an interesting fact, which is the modern art foundry that we use uses statuary bronze, whereas in Lachaise's lifetime, there were all sorts of different alloys, including brass. These are 3 of the Algonquin torso. I include the Venus de Milo because I think they go well together. There's no suggestion that he looked at her, but of course he knew it well. Gerald Nordland described the variety of surface treatments used by Lachaise. Writing to a curator at the Met, he said, "One torso would receive a dark finish, another would be given a burnished bronze mirror finish, still another a mottled gold and bronze matte treatment, and variations all worked out by the artist." Similarly, Egyptian head had lifetime casts and posthumous casts. The posthumous cast on the right is very polished. You might think it's more refined. The lifetime cast, it's possible that it started out very highly polished and has weathered with time. There are 2 shinier versions. One is at the Newark Museum, and one was in the collection of Mr. Egner, and that was recently shown at the Casman Gallery. We have some executive decisions that we need to make. This is an image of La Montagne at his MoMA retrospective. And it was not in bronze ever during his lifetime, but it was cast in cement. And so we had a cast with the silver nitrate patina. And it looked very nice. It looked more like the cement than the bronze. And since there was nothing that said you have to cast it this way, we thought that was getting close to the artist's intention. And so there are now 2 casts made with the silver nitrate patina because we repatinaed a regular bronze patina. You can see it at the Kinney Frelinghuysen House and Studio. The Frelinghuysen House and Studio, the Frelinghuysen Morris House and Studio in Lenox, Mass. As Lachaise is describing his own work, he wrote on the evolution of woman in his oeuvre, "Soon she came to forceful repose, serene, massive as earth, soul turned towards heaven, la montagne. The feet almost disappeared. Mountains neither jump nor walk, but have fertile rolling pastures, broad and soft as fecund breasts." Now, when was the posthumous cast not as good as the lifetime? This is a cast of Scofield Ther in the Met. He actually is they're having an exhibition of Scofield Ther's collection this summer, which I'm really looking forward to. You can see the color of the lifetime cast is just gorgeous, and I don't know how to recreate that with statuary bronze or patina. And there's also an element of the weathering of time. I'm not sure, but it looks like there's some details in the hair, and there's the dual patina, which hasn't been attempted in the posthumous cast, although the posthumous cast is good, and it's better than nothing, in my opinion. There are also other examples where you might see the hand of the artist and be very glad to recognize it. Not so good is this kind of a posthumous cast, which were the rights given to Nelson Rockefeller when he cast, in his opinion, good reproductions do not devalue originals, they enhance the value, and they make more people aware of art. He was one of Lachaise's great patrons, and there's a little story I'm going to get to soon. He believed his collection represented the highest form of art, and he sought to share it with others. Okay, thank you. These are Alva Museum replicas. Not so bad if you're looking to buy one on the internet. So the value of estate casting. This is nude with a coat that was exhibited in plaster because it hadn't yet been cast in bronze at the Armory Show of 1913. So it enables us to cast more and show people this important work that was at such an important exhibition. We don't have the original bronze cast made by Lachaise of Stieglitz, and we do have the plaster, so we're able to make casts of those, and the foundation is hoping to gift one to each institution that was the recipient of Stieglitz's estate. This is Floating Figure. Just have a little more to do. You can see this was her shown in plaster in 1927 at the Bremer Gallery. Due to a posthumous cast, we were able to show her work in Cahors, France. This is the Palais de Justice. There were 5 monumental works by Lachaise there. Here's the Rockefeller story. Lachaise was one of the last works that he finished in his lifetime. It was described in this little piece by Maxwell Armfield. In the dark night, man and woman lie side by side on the bare earth, naked before eternity. He was able to carry this out in large format. It was one of the last works he made. He died suddenly of leukemia, and Lincoln Kirstein exhorted Nelson Rockefeller to turn this into a plaster before it can only last a few more days. He was very dramatic. Must have been in clay. And so thus he did and preserved it for eternity. You can see this at the Kaiket Museum in Tarrytown. We were also, due to a posthumous cast, able to exhibit it in front of the Portland Art Museum in Oregon. above it is a photograph by Louis Palou of an Afghan soldier. Here's a work in Saint-Cirque-la-Popie, just on the east of Cahors. We have Rome. We went also to Budapest, Prague. This was one of my favorite exhibitions in Madrid. It was called Heroínas, Images of Strong Women, and Lachaise was item number 1. That was very exciting. There are some institutions who cannot get over the posthumous part of casting. I was invited to meet with Crystal Bridges Museum, and they took me to lunch. We had lunch under the Jeff Koons, and they said they were not interested at all in a posthumous cast, rather they're interested in lifetime works. I am proud of the posthumous casts that we do, so I was trying to convince them otherwise, absolutely adamant. And they had an exhibition on at that time of the work of William Paley. William Paley bought a posthumous cast. It was good enough for him. It's good enough to give to the Museum of Modern Art. It traveled for 22 months, ended up at Crystal Bridges, and it was there under plexiglass, the only sculpture in the room, surrounded by paintings by Georges Rouault, Bacon, and Giacometti. She was really en beauté, in my opinion, and I was glad to show them that they were charging people money to see this posthumous cast by Lachaise and had it under plexiglass. Verres once said to Lachaise, "Art is the highest expression and not a luxury. Where are the Egyptian bankers today? And Egyptian art survives." All I could think of when I saw that posthumous cast under plexiglass was a saying by Seldes, writing on Lachaise in the New Republic, describing the slow arrow of beauty, vigorously expressing something of a civilization of which speed seems to be the god. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Finally, on this session, we have Jonathan Vernon, who's a PhD candidate at the Courtauld Institute of Art, where he's researching the posthumous writings on Constantin Brancusi in a Cold War context, supervised by the inimitable Professor Christopher Green. He was the contributing editor at the Wellington magazine from 2014 to 2017, and has published widely, most recently writing a book on Modigliani that came out at the same time as the Tate retrospective. But today, he will not be talking to us about Brancusi, but Gonzalez. So take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Ros, and thank you to Sharon and Katy, who put on a great event. I think you'll all agree. And to my fellow panelists as well. Apparently I work at myself, because that was supposed to say Courtauld Institute of Art under there, and I don't know quite what's happened. And the font is different. I picked a very nice font. It's at least 50% of my work on PowerPoints, but oh well. We don't have much time, so I'll get to it. Do I just write, yeah. In February 1956, 14 years after the death of Julio Gonzalez, Art News published an article by David Smith titled "Gonzalez, First Master of the Torch." It appeared shortly before the opening of the first retrospective of Gonzalez's work in the United States at the Museum of Modern Art, New York. Smith's text was perhaps the most durable contribution to a cultural moment that hauled Gonzalez out of the shadow of his collaborator, Picasso, and set the coordinates for his own artistic legacy. However, these coordinates were recalibrated in the late 1980s, when Gonzalez's legatees made a gift of the sculptor's personal archives and the largest extant collection of his work to IVAM, the Valencia Institute of Modern Art. In the wake of that gift, Gonzalez's work would never again be spoken about or truly seen in quite the same way. At the behest of his legatees, the gift included numerous posthumous bronze casts of Gonzalez's ironworks. These had been produced over the years by the legatees themselves, who claimed that Gonzalez would have had his work cast in bronze had the cost not been so prohibitive. These claims, made in the name of the deceased sculptor, awarded the posthumous bronze casts of works that he initially conceived and fashioned in iron permanent legitimacy. The casts entered numerous museum collections and are regularly shown alongside the iron pieces, their fundamental difference acknowledged in wall labels and exhibition catalogues for those willing to look. Just how fundamental the difference between them may be is largely the concern of conservators now. As any number of recent retrospectives show, IVAM and others are well placed to offer a remarkable array of even the large-scale metal sculptures, as long as the distinctions between the cast and the welded, between salvaged metal and poured bronze, are elided in favour of forms. To borrow from the sculptor, as so many now have, they are regarded as drawings in space, and less as objects. This paper is not an account of the legal frameworks at issue in the production of these casts. This has been addressed elsewhere. For example, Alexandre Paragoris notes that under French law, the sculptor's ironworks had to be treated as working plasters for the cast bronzes to be deemed legitimate. Equally, this paper is not a history of those casts. It is in fact my precise wish to approach them not as a mere sequence of productions with legal, scholarly, and theoretical ramifications. Instead, I want to treat them as a body of evidence for the ways in which it was possible to think about Gonzalez's sculpture in a particular historical moment. As will become clear, this task is synonymous with the treatment of posthumous casts as part of a discursive field, rather than merely as objects of discourse. That is, to see their value as constructed, a narrative in which we may choose to participate or not. Needless to say, I don't think that this is a distinction without a difference, or one limited to the demands of a theoretical analysis. Rather, it's a distinction that applies to the cast bronze the same analytical pressure, the same historical weight, that we tend to reserve for the works of 20th century sculpture from which they have multiplied. By making it, the conditions of viewership that structure our experience of posthumous casts are themselves disclosed as historical, and thus moved by any number of invisible hands, be they aesthetic, economic, or ideological. And the question that lies at the end of this process is an ancient one that discloses itself. Quo warranto, by what right? In 1981, 25 years after Smith's article, and 4 years prior to the first IVAM gift, Rosalind Krauss contributed an essay to the catalogue of an exhibition, including several posthumous casts of Gonzalez's works, at Pace Gallery in New York. There, she presented an argument in favour of the bronzes, claiming that, to put it very tersely, since they were part of a practice that included preparatory drawings, the ironworks had always been the result of a process of transcription or copying, in which the given medium was broadly incidental. That essay found a place in the originality of the avant-garde, Krauss's post-structuralist critique of the myth of originality that was supposedly inherent to the modernist tradition. It was also a point of contention in the tete-a-tete triggered by that book's title essay, a debate between Krauss and Albert Elson, curator of the retrospective Rodin Rediscovered at the National Gallery of Art, Washington. The stakes of this debate and the terms contested by it were close to boundless. Paramount among them were the conventions used to discriminate between casts of an artist's work. As president of the College Art Association, Elson had overseen the drafting of an exemplary set of such guidelines, the already mentioned Statement on Standards, which was published in Art Journal in 1974. The importance of this moment to the irrepressible afterlife of so many modern sculptures is a subject of its own, and for this I may once again direct you to Paragoris' 1997 essay, Truth to Materials, Bronze, on the Reproducibility of Truth. But what matters for our attempt to reposition the posthumous cast in dialectical terms is the shift in the conception of Gonzalez's practice that posthumous reproduction entails. In other words, the question that must necessarily frame this paper is what, after Smith's Gonzalez, made Krauss's Gonzalez not only possible, but, history would suggest, irrevocable. One answer takes us to the image world in which Gonzalez's sculpture found its first, perhaps most convincing foothold after his death, a paradigm of American sculpture and a critical language that was developed both to bring discernible order to the new and to transpose that order to its European precedents. The character of this paradigm was manifold. It privileged light, open, linear forms over closed volumes, assembly and construction over carving and modelling, and industrial materials over traditional and traditionally coded plaster, marble, and bronze. Most of all, it incorporated an ineluctable drive towards abstraction. In all of this, the paradigm represented a peculiar kind of order. It took a tradition that was partly defined from its roots in constructivism by its attempt to deprogram the concept of the studio-bound visionary individual and placed it in service of that tradition's structural opposite, the heroic age of abstract expressionism. My PhD research brings to light the ways in which the history of this tradition was rewritten in the 1950s and 1960s, and its social and cultural dimensions, with particular reference to Brancusi. Its significance for our purposes here, however, lies in 1, Smith's function as the figurehead of that tradition, 2, Krauss's role as one of its foremost authors and, by the time of her text on Gonzalez, the chief inquisitor of its high modernist aspirations to purity and self-sufficiency, and 3, the rearticulation of Gonzalez himself as the bridge between constructivism and American abstract sculpture. This is not in itself an answer to the question, what made Krauss's defense of the posthumous cast seem viable in 1981? But it is the skeleton of one. To add flesh to its bones, it is necessary to begin with what has been lost, by reconstructing Smith's Gonzalez. By the time it published Smith's article, Art News was firmly entrenched as the premier forum for discussions of abstract expressionism, discussions in which revisionist histories of American high modernist criticism would come to identify the acutest expressions of its triumphalism. But under the stewardship of Thomas B. Hess, the magazine was also a champion for the de facto sculptural analogue for American painting in the 1950s. More than that, Art News had long been punching in the coordinates for Smith's singular place in the strange collusion between high modernism and the rolled-up sleeves and forged iron and steel of post-war American cultural consciousness. It first anticipated the mythic dimensions of Smith's legacy in a review of his debut exhibition of welded sculpture at Willard Gallery in 1938, calling him a modern blacksmith. By 1946, this image of the lone practitioner had passed over into an industrial landscape, with a reviewer commenting that, quote, Smith's earlier products depend for their effect upon metal's inherent power, ploughshare blades and great grinding blocks producing in the observer the same kind of awe that would accompany a visit to the Bethlehem Steel Works. And we may note that this is an awe inspired not by the products of Bethlehem, then the second largest steel manufacturer in the United States, which included those foremost monuments to American history, the Chrysler and Empire State Buildings. It's an awe generated by the industrial process itself, of metal captured mid-translation, originary, even primordial. Assessing the context, then, of Smith's essay for Art News, we may conclude that the importance of Gonzalez as a welder, the first master of the torch, was in part the consequence of a set of cultural positions that not only structured Smith's work, but also the larger world of contemporary American criticism. This is not to say that Smith's understanding of Gonzalez developed in the thrall of the period's high cultural triumphalism. Indeed, Smith had seen one of the products of Picasso and Gonzalez's earliest collaborations, the 1929 project for a monument to Guillaume Apollinaire, in Cahiers d'Art that same year. The painter and collector John Graham, meanwhile, showed Smith 3 of Gonzalez's sculpture from his own collection as early as 1933. These included the forged iron reclining woman and head, the latter of which he gifted to Smith. Seeing these works prompted Smith to produce a series of works that directly channeled their spirit, which he identified vitally in the fusion of pieces of scrap iron. And this brings us to what I do mean to say, namely that there was something visible in Gonzalez's sculpture that made the revival of interest in the sculptor's work during the 1950s an inevitable consequence of the concept of Gonzalez the artist welder, not the other way around. That something, as Smith makes wholly explicit, was iron, or rather, the formal possibilities and aesthetics of iron. The tangent of Smith's analysis that makes this most palpable begins in the Gonzalez family's metal workshop in Barcelona, where the sculptor first learnt the practice as a child, and ends with him, quote, looking back lovingly at Gaudi's cathedral of the Sagrada Familia, respecting Gaudi's source in nature and the unities of iron and stone. Smith further chose to reproduce La Grande Trompette for the purpose of a direct comparison between Gonzalez's frequent use of stone bases for his iron sculptures and the iron trumpets held aloft by Gaudi's stone angels. There is, he says, a marked unity here, a sensitive feeling for material and proportion, the feeling of flying form and unorthodox balance. It should be noted that there's nothing autochthonous being inferred in this comparison. The Catalonian soil is not an ingredient of the form of alchemy being proposed. There is only a material with an aesthetic potential that, Smith and Gonzalez agreed, had ancient roots, but nevertheless had to be discovered again and again. Smith practically blurts out the following in breathless comedy, quote, "When a man is trained in metalworking and has pursued it as labour, with the ideal of art represented by oil painting, it is very difficult to conceive that what has been labour and livelihood is the same means by which art can be made. The apotheosis of this struggle, Smith decided, was that, quote, craft and smithery became submerged in the concept of sculpture. Like a painting, every minute part bears the caress of the artist. No other hands have touched this work. There are no production marks, no caster's errors, nor shrinkage from pouring." This is not actually important anymore. These are steel works that I was going to talk about in an analogous sense, but ignore them for now, they're just misleading. In fact, let's go there. What emerges here is that Smith's Gonzalez is scarcely assimilable to the idea of sculpture that Smith himself was taken to epitomize, for reasons I will return to shortly. But what about Krauss's Gonzalez? In short, Krauss understands Gonzalez's large-scale iron sculptures as, quote, quite literal copies or transcriptions of his drawings from models, and stakes his abstraction on the transition between them. Contrary to the found objects and materials of Picasso's assemblages, which Krauss permits a signifying function, the same elements in Gonzalez's work are ascribed a mimetic role that reduces them to lines, planes, divisions of space. This, Krauss writes, was to harness, quote, the baffles of translation, a process that moved Gonzalez further and further from the corporeal object and closer to a cursiveness that space itself would render abstract. As such, Krauss concludes, the material is irrelevant. What matters is the copy and its logical extension ad infinitum, or perhaps to as many bronzes as might be expedient. So, what exactly does she mean when she calls the iron woman combing her hair a quite literal copy of the drawing? As if the drawing alone could have been handed off to an assistant and produced the same result. How is it that, when she reaches for analogies to this idea of copying, they all involve reproductions made in the artist's absence, as if Gonzalez had not himself fashioned the works in iron? And what could possibly justify the identification of abstraction, conflated as it is in her analysis with the movement from flat surface to three-dimensional space, with illegibility? What does that mean for abstraction as such? What it is intended to mean should, by now, be clear. When Krauss states that, quote, Gonzalez's access to abstraction is a function of a process of copying that translates from one material to another, the translation she's talking about signifies an actual function of language, namely, one in which the art object becomes self-referential and is thus automatically deemed to subscribe to an imagined condition of originality that the copy itself negates. Before we can test this image of Gonzalez against the viable alternatives, I think it's important to note that the questions I have just asked of Krauss's argument highlight a set of manoeuvres that I take to be symptomatic of her cultural position. To understand this, we might pause to consider a method of structuring history that is often assumed in analyses of the period, negative dialectics. Important as negation was for a Trotskyist like Clement Greenberg, for the critical theory of the 1970s and 1980s, it was programmatic. And Krauss's post-structuralist turn, isolating as it did the tenets of Greenbergian high modernism, is a case in point. To recognize the currency of dialectical negation in this moment is to demand a reckoning with the assumptions that any new critique necessarily retains, in its fictions of rupture as much as in its evident continuity. In the case of Krauss's Gonzalez, the critique is codependent with its object to such an extent that it becomes inherently self-cancelling. She assumes, with Greenberg, that the aspirations of the avant-garde were expressible as a set of universal values, and that those values ultimately converged on abstraction. The primary function of her post-structuralism was only to contest what those values were. As a result, we may see Krauss as the carrier of a torch, not that of Gonzalez and Smith, but rather of the image that American modernist criticism would have their legacies project. It is precisely because she cannot look away from this image that she fails to see Smith's Gonzalez, and in fact dismisses his account of the sculptor's work as an autobiographical mirage. But what, you may ask, about medium specificity? Was that not a part of the high modernist paradigm? Well, the post-war Greenberg had no interest in medium specificity when it came to sculpture. Rather, as he claimed in 1949, quote, "Under the modernist reduction, sculpture has turned out to be almost as exclusively visual in its essence as painting itself." If the purchase of the sculptural tradition encompassed by the constructivists Picasso, Gonzalez, and Smith had once been attributable to the material logic of iron and steel, to the procedures of found object sculpture and assemblage, it was now reducible to the colonization of space by form. This, in case you haven't noticed, is an entirely adequate description of the notion of sculpture for which Gonzalez is made to stand in Krauss's essay, and thus one of the founding documents for the legitimacy of the sculptor's posthumous casts. Are we still prepared to subscribe to such an anachronism? What about the heroic myth that undergirded it? For here too, we find Gonzalez wrenched from the avant-garde as he understood it to legitimate the reproduction of his work. Smith was careful to note that, quote, "Gonzalez was adamant in pointing out the relationship between his sculpture and the real elements, such as hair, teeth, eyes, which in a very indirect way composed them." Needless to say, it was in the interest of neither Greenberg nor Krauss to absorb such leading information into their accounts of the sculptor's work. It was precisely the corresponding elements of Smith's sculpture that Greenberg dismissed as Baroque excesses in 1952. And, when he finally conceded that modernist sculpture had proven inadequate to the achievements of painting in an article on Smith for Art in America, published the same year as Smith's essay on Gonzalez, Greenberg wrote the following, quote, "It is significant that modernist American sculpture should have succumbed so epidemically to biomorphism, and that then, after the fanciful and decorative improvisations of plant, bone, muscle, and other organic forms, the most conspicuous result of the diffusion of the welding torch among American sculptors has been a superior kind of garden statuary and a new, oversized kind of objet d'art." The passing of the welding torch had failed, not because of any limitations to abstraction as a sculptural language, but because the figure had re-entered its syntax through the back door. Of course, it had never truly left, but for the purposes of Krauss too, its implications of metaphor and thus the surrealist roots of Gonzalez's sculpture were inadmissible. As she herself conceded, quote, "In the case of assemblage in direct metal, the production of copies or multiples in bronze violates the conceptual uniqueness of the original, which consists in its metaphoric conditions." In this particular game, Paragoras is unplayable, and it will only do to quote her directly. Quote, "Krauss's insistence on what she sees as Gonzalez's characteristic mode of transcribing and copying is linked to a wish to close out the possibility of a surrealist interpretation, however broad, of Gonzalez's work. This results in a need to distance it from that of Picasso, whose sculpture in the 1930s cannot avoid a surrealist interpretation." End quote. The context and content of the sculptor's surrealism, which Paragoras goes on to detail, is simply indispensable to our understanding of his art. That its function was intrinsically metaphorical, and that the material and its method of assembly were the primary vehicles of its metaphors, should be beyond dispute. We are now, I hope, closer to understanding the stakes and structure of Krauss's wish, as Paragoras puts it, and better equipped to ask whether we are well served by its being granted. In closing, Krauss ends her essay by stating that, quote, "The question of the copy is not simply a moral issue, as in the French term for aesthetic copyright, droit de morale. The question of the copy is fully an aesthetic question." I quite agree with this sentiment, but her attendant claim that the copy is necessarily demystifying should be subject to further scrutiny. The question that persists is, whose mystique? Thank you.
So thank you very much to all the speakers. Do we have a little time for questions or 5 minutes? Okay, I might take my prerogative as being the person with the microphone to ask the first question, and then I promise to let it go. One thing I was thinking about throughout the papers that came up in Jonathan's regarding the drawings and the sculptures and the relationship between 2D and 3D, taking that to the next step of photography of the sculptures or photography by sculptors such as Lachaise, which then gives birth to a work, a three-dimensional work, and then Italy's different approach to three-dimensional reproduction rights and how that relates to copyright of photographs of sculptures. I was wondering if any of you had anything to say about that.
Well, probably not with regard to Gonzalez, in fact. Brancusi is the one who comes to mind when you're talking about photographs of his sculpture. But I don't know what kind of purchase it really has on the practice of posthumous casting. Actually, no, wait, I do. Brancusi's photographs are, first and foremost, a document of the studio as space of display and a space of experiment as the ideal conditions in which his sculpture was to be seen. And in fact, we've finished talking about Brancusi now in the context of the whole talk, but it's another element of the problem with his posthumous casts, I think, that their idea of finish is taken from photographs taken with very specific lights hitting them to produce very specific kinds of effects. So I suppose that would highlight the faults of certain documentary materials when it comes to translating later.
And Giuseppe, in the case of so if you have the molds, you can cast as many as you like. In terms of if someone then took a photograph of that cast, if the artist, it's still within their copyright, and you wanted permission to reproduce that photograph, is it the estate that you go to?
Well, it's the holder of the copyright. The copyright still exists and it has not expired. But yes, I mean, the specific provision regarding the molds and the fact that if you transfer the property of the mold, you transfer automatically, the right to reproduction only applies to, molds or, copyright law is quite old, was 1941. So it did not really address 3D or other. It does address photographs, but not in the digital context. Okay. I mean, only if you have the negative, then you are entitled to make reproductions. But it's rigid and limited and should be historically interpreted.
In short, it's the photography or as you would expect it in other jurisdictions as opposed to in the Italian jurisdiction where it's very specific to the molds.
Yeah, correct.
Good, okay. Suddenly realised I was summarising a lawyer and that was dangerous. Do we have any questions from the floor? I think there are mics going around.
In terms of Mr. G's Giacometti's, is there any physical, discernible way of differentiating between the false reproductions and the original?
Well, The court did not really address this matter. It simply said that the works that Mr. G had were made in violation of copyright, and that was and as a result of this, they should be considered as counterfeited works, and that is all what the court said. It was what was required to say. I mean, it did not go any further into discussions as to what is original and what is not. Does this answer your question?
Yes,
Yes.
in one part, but if one wants to find out how to identify one against the other, how does one go about it?
Well, I don't know. I mean, again, I think you should consider this question from the perspective of each single jurisdiction. There's no uniform copyright law. I mean, so under Italian law, some courts held that if you, that a cast is always a reproduction. I mean, it's never an original, because the original is the terracotta or the plaster. And there are certain decisions that contain this remark. I mean. So they are not, the court's judgment do not help to answer this dilemma.
Oh, I understand the law is unclear. I just wondered if physically one could tell the difference.
That I cannot answer this question, I'm sorry.
Maybe time for just one more.
So I was just going to ask, you see sometimes documents purporting to show that there are limited editions of Italian sculpture, but is such a document actually possible? Is it possible to produce in Italian law a document that is binding such that you can limit the number of casts made?
It would have a contractual effect. I mean, you can certainly agree with the person you sell, but it would not, or a certain limited edition, but this would not have an effect, a general effect. I mean, these provisions are valid, but only with respect to the context in which they were made. They could not have, as we say, in effect erga omnes. So
does that mean you would limit a particular edition, but you cannot make a general limitation?
if you are the artist, you mean, or the holder of the plaster? You can make this a document, yes, but who controls the game is the person who holds the plaster. So it's difficult for a third party to enforce or to go against further editions that were made or further copies that were made.
Because if the plaster is sold, then is the new owner bound by what the former owner decided, or it starts again?
I think it starts again, yes.
So basically there's no such thing as a limited edition?
No, not in my country at least, yes. Not in my country. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I think we're going to have to say that's enough for questions, I'm sure. At the end, we'll have it at the end. Yeah, we'll have a discussion at the end. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Rosalind.